Kia ora koutou katoa. What a privilege to be here today. What I'm doing with you today is going through a strategic presentation. It's a wander through the strategic landscape for the food and fibre sector here in New Zealand. I'm going to touch on who and what Te Puna Whakaaronui is. I'm going to talk about the importance of focusing on the opportunity. I'm going to touch on the New Zealand context, and importantly, I'm going to touch on the global context. I'm going to discuss 3 drivers of change, and then I'm going to sum up by focusing on the so what. Without further ado, Te Puna Whakaaronui is a think tank. It hangs off the side of MPI. It is funded by MPI. And for those of you who are familiar with the jargon, it's what we call a small green triangle. Its purpose is to provide an outside-in approach for the food and fibre sector here in New Zealand. It's got a governance board comprised of some of our leading public servants. But the thought leaders team, and I won't read them out, but you can see them listed up there. The thought leaders team are comprised of deeply experienced, excepting myself, very intelligent food and fibre experts here in New Zealand. It's a real privilege to work with them. Jared Mayer is here today. He runs the management team for Te Puna Whakaaronui. It's my privilege to present their work. What I'd like to do is touch on the importance of focusing on the opportunity. We have seen the emergence of a number of competing dialogues in the New Zealand food and fibre sector, and I'll rehearse them for you. One of them is, hey, the food and fibre sector is a sunset sector. Young people don't want to work in it anymore. The average age of a farmer is over 60 years old. What we need to do is diversify our economy. We need to focus on technology, we need to focus on education, we need to focus on tourism. We don't need to focus on sort of a dirty old agricultural industry. That is so last century. Surprisingly, that dialogue has achieved quite a lot of traction, and it has affected things like science funding for the food and fibre sector in New Zealand. A second dialogue is that the sector is an environmental problem. It's associated with half of our emissions, it's associated with poor water quality, it's associated with poor animal husbandry and pressure on biodiversity here in New Zealand. And so, you know, farmers aren't doing good enough. They're not good stewards for our land. Another dialogue is that, hang on a minute, you guys. We represent 80% of merchandise exports. We manage some of the leading farm systems globally. We take huge pride in the way we farm. And actually what we don't need is a bunch of townies picking on us and trying to get us to do our jobs better. What we need is a little more respect for what we're doing on the land. This dialogue that we're an environmental problem is unfair. Just leave us alone. We're doing well enough, thank you. A couple of comments. First of all of these dialogues have their own merit. Depending on whether you're using a lens of the environment or a social lens or an economic lens or a commercial lens, whether you're talking about a New Zealand natural interest lens or a geopolitical lens, each of these dialogues has various amounts of merit. But what they're not is they're not complete strategies because they're not investable. And that's important. If you can't invest in it, you can't move forward in it. And what we need is strategy for this country which is investable and which will take us forward as a nation. When we're thinking about the New Zealand context, the starting point for the conversation is that the sector is massive for us. It's 82% of merchandise exports. It's 14% of employment, it's 11% of GDP. It's a huge part of our land use. And we're talking about 4 million kilometres of ocean space. It is an intrinsic part of New Zealand, it's an intrinsic part of our history, it's an intrinsic part of our economy. And whenever we're talking about strategy, you've got to start from where we are, and that is where we are. Also, when we think about the food and fibre sector in New Zealand, we need to think about New Zealand Inc. itself. How are we situated as a country? And so two things are true. On the one hand, New Zealand is a pretty good place to live. We've got a pretty good standard of living. But we also have some dramatic headwinds heading our way. I'm talking about things like the economic wealth and social disparities we are seeing in this country. I'm talking about the imperative to decarbonise the economy. We've got an ageing population which will impose superannuation costs on us, but also rising healthcare costs on us. We've got an evolution of global consumer needs and food and fibre systems globally, and we have capacity and productivity constraints in New Zealand. Very simply, without clear strategy and the capacity to implement change, this country will go backwards. Unless our sector can continue to grow, New Zealand faces stormy seas. Now, the good news is that the sector can continue to grow. Let's call it $50 billion of export revenues today. If we can grow at 2% a year, we can add another $37 billion by 2050. 2% growth is not high historically. Historically, we've achieved 4% growth in the sector. So we're not talking about massive levels of growth to continue to grow the sector. Equally importantly, there are places for that growth to come from. Now, starting with some of the factors which will support growth in our natural food system, some of the places to look which will underpin growth and drive growth. First of all, improved environmental sustainability measures. Now, the reason I call that out and the reason that that's so important is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. The adaptation of our dairy and meat sectors. They're fantastic sectors, but taking more of a regenerative approach and aiming for environmental excellence is on strategy for those sectors. Implementing new methane mitigation technologies, hugely important. We can put in place an emissions strategy through He Waka Eka Noa, but without the supporting technologies, that simply won't work. Incentivising carbon sequestration is really important and on strategy and an economic opportunity for New Zealand. Accelerating ocean farming technologies, clearly a $1 billion opportunity. Focusing on natural fibres in New Zealand and circular systems in New Zealand, another $1 billion opportunity, and the health and wellness sector, another $1 billion opportunity. What I'm saying here is not only is there really good growth to be protected and enhanced in our current natural food system, but there are blue spaces for us to enter into that represent significant growth for this economy going forward. To support that, really deepening the food and fibre investment ecosystem is important because we do need new businesses, new billion-dollar industries to drive this economy forward. 4 things that are really critical. First of all, an absolute commitment to environmental excellence. And I want to take a moment here to focus on that. That is a huge assertion from Te Puna Whakaaronui. Why am I so confident about that? Taia ora, tangata ora. The land and the people together. A values level Tia Māori perspective about a reciprocal relationship between people and the land, caring for our lands and waters as part of nature, our lands and waters will care for us. That's one reason, and it's a values level reason, and it's part of who we are as farmers and New Zealanders. In my view, that's the most important reason. A second reason, though, if you're a little bit drier, is social licence to operate. Very simply, there's far more people in our towns and cities than what there are in our rural sector, and they demand environmental excellence. We know the politics of that. We've seen the politics of that play out in the media over the last few years. That idea of social licence isn't just a New Zealand construct, it's also necessary for us to sell our goods into international markets, and importantly, to position New Zealand. If we want to sell into the natural food segment, which we desperately want to do, we will have to position ourselves in a positive way in the space of environmental sustainability. Those two segments, they go together. One further reason. I've given you three, I'm giving you a fourth one. One further reason. All sectors in this country, enterprises and sectors, they grow until they hit a constraint. Variably, those constraints are financial constraints, demand-side constraints, or supply-side constraints. Supply-side constraints, catchments running out of water, catchments running out of nutrient leaching capacity. And so what you get is these supply-side constraints which suppress the growth of a sector. And so there are four reasons, and there are more, why environmental excellence is critical. Other things we need to do: alignment of incentives, investment and policy to enable and accelerate innovation, enabling the current natural food system, and sustained leadership to realise the potential in new sectors and markets. Moving into the global context, we are not alone. I'm not going to recite this slide, you can see it up there. What we're seeing is major economies around the world formulate industrial policy and say, here's where we see advantage. And sometimes that's about food security and it's about self-supply of food. There are 100 countries around the world that have well-developed industrial policy. I'm using that in the economic sense. What that means is, in the context of climate change, in the context of new technologies, countries are staking out those areas where they can see they can have national competitive advantage. 100 economies around the world are in that space, including some of the biggest economies in the world. I would put it to you that the New Zealand food and fibre sector is a prime opportunity for New Zealand to have a developed industrial policy. It's not just governments that are on the front foot in this space, it's big companies globally. So we've just heard from the last speaker that there's an enormous amount of money flowing into the modern food space. But it's not just the startups that are being funded. It is major food companies around the world who are on the front foot with these technologies. We are seeing an enormous acceleration in this space. Well, New Zealand is the first report by Te Puna Whakaaronui. We identify three drivers of change, and we identify that we're seeing unprecedented levels of change in global food and fibre systems. The first is in the climate change space. In a nutshell, what we are seeing is that we're failing to hit milestones to maintain warming at 1.5 to 2 degrees, and that the outcomes of global warming are at the severe end of what was predicted. I'm talking about floods and droughts and water tables running low. What we're seeing is very pronounced impacts on food and fibre production systems globally, on natural food and fibre production systems globally, and unprecedented volatility. That's got implications. I'm not here to talk about climate change today, but it's got clear implications for us in New Zealand. The first is actually that there'll be pretty strong demand for our natural foods and fibres in international markets because of that impact in global markets on the supply side. There is a clear opportunity for us to take a leadership position in natural foods if we also take a leadership position in environmental excellence. We need a uniquely New Zealand approach to environmental excellence. Just saying regenerative farming isn't good enough. It's about what that means for us in New Zealand. Climate change mitigation, I'm talking about things like carbon sequestration and methane technologies, is on strategy. Climate change adaptation, I'm talking about water storage here in New Zealand, and a whole bunch of other activity is on strategy for us. On the one hand, we are seeing the continued commoditisation of food. Most food and fibres around the world are sold on a commodity basis, but we are also seeing the continued growth of premium segments. Some of that's about health and wellness, and we think that's a space where New Zealand can play strongly. Some of it, happily, is about natural foods. Some of it is about being really climate conscious. So there are whole segments out there who are buying based on carbon footprint and ethical production. Some of it's longevity seekers, old people wanting to live longer. And they're just a few of the segments. What we're seeing is very significant growth and continued segmentation in international markets. That is both a threat and an opportunity for us here in New Zealand. It's a threat because some of these new technologies could substitute for our dairy and meat products around the world. It's an opportunity because by blending this technology with some of our natural foods and fibres, there are tremendous blue spaces in the area of functional foods and health and wellness, which we can enter. It's competitively very tough, but also a huge opportunity set and very exciting for us. The rate of change is critical, and that's why our next 2 reports will focus on modern foods, the rate of change, and then the opportunities for New Zealand to participate in this area of modern foods. When we think about all of this strategically in a global context, it is hugely challenging to forecast or to predict the future, because we do see a combination of sort of geopolitical change and supply chain disruption, of modern foods and changing technologies, of consumer segmentation, and an evolution of natural food systems and pressure on natural food systems. All of those things combine to make the future of food value chains really, really difficult to predict. The antidote to that is to monitor what's happening globally. So first of all, make no mistake, the New Zealand food and fibre sector has done fantastically well. But we are seeing unprecedented levels of change globally. And what that means is that having clear strategy is critical, but actually having the capacity as a food and fibre system to innovate critically is even more critical. There are some building blocks. First of all, let's continue to do really well with New Zealand natural foods and fibres. Let's really focus on that idea of a uniquely New Zealand approach to regenerative farming. And let's not be scared of modern foods. Let's look at modern foods and say, hey, where can New Zealand play in this space to create new industries? From Te Puna Whakaaronui, what you'll see is a series of reports that will help inform the strategic dialogue of the fantastic progress being achieved across New Zealand. As a country, my aspiration is what we might see emerge as an industrial policy for New Zealand food and fibre that will take this country into the next century with confidence, environmental excellence, and financial prosperity. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.